Hello and off we rejoin for a new episode in our Who's Who of Watchmaking series, and today we'll be talking about an independent brand, but naturally no ordinary independent, since we'll be going over the history of one of the most prestigious names in watchmaking, if not the most prestigious, Patek Philippe. And we all know how it started, or maybe not, reason why we'll get back on this story. So a young Polish émigré called Antoni Patek first met Franciszek Czapek in 1839, also a Polish émigré but of Czech origin, and they started to make pocket watches together. But when a few years later this didn't work out any longer between the two, Antoni Patek threw in his lot with a Frenchman who had developed an innovative stem winding and setting system, the crown. That man was Jean-Adrien Philippe, and by 1851 Patek Philippe was born. It's easy to assume that the rest was a gold-plated road to success, but Patek Philippe wasn't always the behemoth it is now. In fact, Thierry Stern, today's CEO and most importantly today's owner of the brand, well, he was closer to the truth when back in 2014 he referred to Patek as a niche brand due to the relatively low numbers of watches it produces per year. I mean, the party line is that the brand still only produces around 50,000 timepieces per year, but the most basic math involving numbers and boutiques around the world and the number of watches in said boutique at any one point would put the figure maybe a bit higher than that. Anyhow, back in 1872, when Patek had its sight on the New World expansion, the idea of making 50,000 watches would have seemed like a total pipe dream. It was actually Rio de Janeiro, or more specifically the Rio-based retailer Gondolo and Laborio, that kickstarted Patek Philippe's timepiece business. It was in November 1872 that the first watches were sent to this store. That one led to 22,000 watches and a retail relationship second only in importance to the one with Tiffany & Co., which began with the handshake between Antoni Patek and Charles Louis Tiffany in 1851, so really at the origin of the brand. This relationship with Gondolo and Laborio is intriguing because this was a retailer who sold watches to ordinary people, not millionaires or royalty. It even set up a subscription service to help people buy into the brand. 180 people signed up and paid the equivalent of 10 francs over 79 weeks. A prize draw was also incorporated into this scheme, with a lucky number being drawn each year and the winner getting his Patek for whatever he had paid up to that point. This initiative is a prime example of Patek Philippe's early realization that a brand is nothing without marketing, an attitude we will see recurring throughout the brand's history. By 1924, despite the luxury watch market coming to a complete standstill during World War I, 28% of Patek Philippe's business was now wristwatches. However, in a move that symbolized Patek's slightly dismissive view of wrist-worn timepieces at the time, rather than making its own movements at this stage, it was still relying on an ébauche from the likes of Lecoutre, Piguet, Mélan and Duret. Not all of these movements were of the highest quality, and Patek even had differencing price points for its watches to reflect the varying qualities of the movement. Well, as strategies go, it wasn't the smartest move, and by 1930 Patek, despite having just accepted the Graves Super Complication Commission, one of the most complicated pocket watches ever made and commissioned by banker Henry Graves in order to outdo the Grande Complication pocket watch owned by US car maker James Ward Packard, produced by rival Vacheron Constantin. Well, Patek was seriously staring down the barrel of collapse. Gondolo and Laborio, once such a goldmine for the brand, had been totally destroyed by the war and a depressed economy, and now owed Patek Philippe a very large amount of money at the time. So the brand was even driven to melting down gold watch cases in order to pay its employee. In a move that was to change both Patek and its fortune, in 1933 the board accepted an offer from respected dial makers Stern Frères rather than going with Lecoultre's bid. One of the first things the Sterns did was to get rid of the theory, quality of price nonsense, and decided to start making the wristwatch movements in-house. It was from here that the Patek Philippe we would recognize today began to emerge. Under the new technical director, Jean Pfister, watch reference numbers were used, the watches were furnished with original calibers made in-house, and the mastery of extreme complications such as Grande Sonnerie. And Pfister didn't mess around. Between 1934 and the outbreak of World War II in 1939. 10 new calibers for both men and women were introduced. There was even a chronograph movement, which was based on a Valjoux, but completely overhauled by Patek. So despite having moderate success in its hometown of Geneva, as well as in other European hubs, the Sterns knew that the most important market to break was the US, something Anthony Patek understood, having done just that back in 1855 in a New World trip that led to the brand's formative relationship with Tiffany & Co. So in 1937, Henri Stern was sent out to America to convince the great and good to spend their hard-earned dollars on luxury Swiss watches. By the time war started, Patek Philippe had started to turn a modest profit, but the European market was plunged into chaos once again. So Stern briefly returned to Switzerland, but by 1940 he was back in New York and helping Patek benefit from the comparatively buoyant US market. So business savvy was Henry Stern that he even managed to get in with the US Armed Forces, supplying them with imported chronographs from Universal Geneva watches from 1942 when the US entered World War II. Because the US suffered none of the hardship Europe did after World War II, it was in a position to buy luxuries such as watches, which the consumers obviously did very enthusiastically, because in terms of sales, the post-war US market had as much of an effect on global watch sales as China would do at the beginning of the noughties. It would take another 20 years before the likes of Germany, Italy, and even England were in a position to import watches of Patek's value, but the US was booming and people were buying. Patek obviously benefited from this, but despite continued advertising campaign, which could now boast Geneva and New York, it was still a brand for those in the know rather than the masses. The end of the war marked a period of expansion and innovation, but one that sadly wasn't to be seen by Charles-Henri Stern, who died on April 2nd, 1944. One of the many things Charles Mr. Stern didn't get to witness was the launch of the Gyro Max Balance, an invention that Patek biographer Nick Fuchs described as so good they patented it twice, in 1949 and 1951 respectively. The balance in question is an adjustable mass balance wheel, which means that instead of weight adjustment screws on the outside of the wheel, as in traditional balances, this has 6 to 8 turnable weights called collets. When the cutout part of the collet is pointed towards the outside of the balance wheel, the heavier side is towards the middle, which decreases the moment of inertia, thereby increasing its speed. Reverse the position and the collet and the wheels move slower. The collets tend to work in opposing pairs, with the watchmaker having the option of adjusting them singularly or as pair in order to adjust the wheel's balance. It would have been an amazing achievement at any time, but coming as it did after World War II, it showed that Patek Philippe was not going to cling to the past in order to get the brand on steadier financial ground. It was going to improve its fortune through innovation. It wasn't just in the mechanical realm that Patek were future-proofing, because in 1948 Henry Stern set up an electronics division with the express purpose of investigating quartz technology. It was a clever move, and one that would have been even more intelligent had the little Swiss snobbery and, let's say, a lack of vision or conservatism about putting quartz into a wristbound form confined its experimentation to clocks only. Gyro Maxes aside, Patek spent most of the 50s making watches that appealed to a new jet-set generation of moneyed global nomads. In 1958, the Comet 4 became the first scheduled jet to fly out of New York City, and Patek capitalized on this by marketing its reference 2597, which gained the monikers the cross-country or the two-time zone to the New World travelers, emphasizing the push-button time, 2 pushers at 8 and 10 o'clock, which allowed the time zone to be easily changed. There were other innovations mostly created by the avant-garde designer Gilbert Habert, who Henri Stern hired in 1959 to shake things up, but like the linear time display Cobra, which contained the tonneau-shaped caliber designed by Louis Cotier, a design adapted by Urbeck in 2006 for its UR CC1. These are confined to prototypes, or were confined to prototypes, and are in cases in the Patek Philippe Museum. December 25th, 1969 is a date many in the watch industry will have etched on their psyche. It was the day Seiko unveiled the Astron, the world's first quartz watch, and the thing that almost killed off the Swiss watch industry. The Swiss were completely ignorant of the developments happening in the quartz world. In 1960, research had begun on what was to become the Beta 1, the first Swiss quartz watch that was to lead to the Beta 21, so named because it was developed at the Centre Électronique Horloger laboratories in Neuchâtel by 20 Swiss watch brands, including Omega, IWC, Rolex, and of course Patek. Interesting, no? The first watch containing the Beta 2, the Omega Electro Quartz, was launched in 1970 and could have been a competitor, a serious competitor to the Japanese, but the Swiss reluctance to throw in any marketing weight behind it, combined with President Nixon withdrawing the US from the Bretton Woods system in 1971, which contributed to the Swiss mechanical watch industry to go into free fall. I mean, the reason for this is because the Bretton Woods system was an accord signed by the Allies in 1944, which saw the birth of the International Monetary Fund, an economy stabilizer that tied all the major currencies to gold. Once Nixon withdrew, the dollar became decoupled and its value dropped from 4 francs 33 for $1 to 1 franc 60. The consequence is that overnight, Swiss watches became 3 times more expensive, which sent the whole industry into a dizzying freefall. From having a 43% market share in 1977, by 1983 the Swiss had just 15% of the watch market. In 1974 it was producing 84.4 million watches and movements, and just 9 years later that had dropped to just 30.2 million. That's a serious resizing of the industry. But Patek Philippe did better than most. It diverted some of its funds to developing its own quartz caliber, meaning that by 1979 it was self-sufficient in terms of its quartz watch production, but it was also making interesting gains in the auction world, thanks in no small part to a man called Alan Banbury. Banbury started at Patek in 1965, having joined the brand from British jeweler Gerard, and his auction house dealing started merely as a way to furnish one room, the visitors' waiting room at the Rue du Rhône headquarters, to be precise. Banbury and Philippe Stern, I mean that's a new generation of owner, thought it would be a good idea to display examples from Patek's back catalogue in this room, except they didn't have any to hand. So Banbury got wind of a private auction of the personal effects of a Swiss actor called Michel Simon. Among the lots was a collection of 400 pocket and wristwatches, which, as luck would have it, contained 5 vintage Pateks in excellent condition. This archive was the genius of the Patek Philippe Museum and the beginnings of the brand's cleverly driving up its own prices at auction in order to finish its burgeoning vintage collection. But it wasn't just acquisition that was driving up prices. Patek were clever enough to mount exhibitions of these extraordinary pieces around the world, using them as a way to reacquaint the public with the brand and illustrate the prestige accrued by 130 years in the business. However, what really cemented Patek Philippe's reputation as an auction house hit was the decision made by the Geneva-based Habsburg Fellman, later known as Antiquorum, to hold a monobrand auction called the Art of Patek Philippe. It was a move that cemented Patek's reputation as a brand of value and importance to connoisseurs and collectors alike. Interestingly enough, Patek's reputation, like a few other luxury brands at the time, was also saved by steel and Gérald Jantat. The story goes that Jantat did the sketch for the Nautilus launch in 1976 in just 5 minutes, inspired by the porthole of a ship. Named after Captain Nemo's ship in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, this was a luxury watch in steel. As with its main competitor Audemars Piguet, who created the market in 1972 with the Royal Oak, making a high-end piece in steel was completely new for Patek, and although the watches weren't exactly cheap, they did appeal to a younger clientele who wanted something more versatile than a dress watch, but didn't want to slum it with the current offering in steel. It was a bold move, but one that was to create an icon for Patek, one that is still relevant 40 years later. Having shored up the brand's past, Philippe Stern was now able to turn his attention to the future, and that meant investing in machinery and new technology. The only brief diversion from this was the celebrations in 1989 for the brand's 150th anniversary, front and center of which was the Caliber 89. 9 years in the making and the most complicated watch around at the time. It was a 88.2mm representation of technical mastery, featuring a perpetual calendar, astronomical indication, grande and petite sonnerie, a minute repeater, and a retrograde date, and plenty more, with 33 complications in total. It was also a brilliant marketing tool that, thanks to its tour, reignited the public's desire for complicated watches, something that Patek was about to be in a very good position to satisfy, thanks to the work starting on a 25,000 square meter space in a rather uninspiring location called Blanc-les-Ouates. It seemed like once Patek had got most of its operation under one single roof, the brand opened its new facility in 1996, there was simply no stopping it. The Pagoda Reference 5500, which was launched to commemorate the opening, was swiftly followed in 1999 by the 24, a bracelet watch specifically designed for women that was to pave the way for the industry-leading Ladies First chronograph in 2009, which saw Patek Philippe debut a new movement, its CH29-535 PS caliber, in a woman's watch, something that was unheard of at the time. Then there was the Star Caliber 2000, a watch with 21 complications, including a running equation of time synced to the perpetual calendar, which could be set using a rotating bezel. And additional to this, and by 2005, Patek started appearing with the words "advanced research" on the dial, indicating that these contain Patek's latest innovation, for instance a Swiss lever escapement with a silicon escape wheel made using Cylinvar. This was something Patek's specifically formed advanced research department had been working on for a while. So charged with finding new ways to stop the mechanism from being affected by things such as temperature, magnetism and friction. Its first innovation was this version of silicon that was developed by XEM, the Swiss Center for Electronics and Microtechnology in Neuchâtel also, in an exclusive collaboration with Rolex and the Swatch Group, and has unique properties such as extreme hardness that reduces wear and also the need of lubrication. It is anti-magnetic and extremely light. Cylinvar then turned up in 2006 Gyro Max Balance spring, which featured the patented terminal curve design, which basically means the spring is thicker at the outer end, a detail that forces more symmetric expansion and contraction. By 2011, Patek had decided to ditch the balance wheel altogether in favor of an hourglass-shaped components made from Cylinvar. This was a very important breakthrough in terms of finding ways to minimize aerodynamic drag, and was also the final innovation that led to Patek Philippe ditching the Poinçon de Genève in favor of its own hallmark. As the spirit of technical innovation has started to reign supreme at Patek, Philippe Stern felt that the criteria de Poinçon de Genève had not been updated in order to take these advances into account. Mr. Stern also wasn't happy that the stipulation that only watches made in the canton of Geneva still applied. So in 2009, he introduced the Patek Philippe seal, a hallmark of quality that is applied to every entire finished watch after it has been tested against stringent in-house criteria. Speculation about Patek's motives in doing so were rife, and one of the main ones was that Patek felt that its watches should be ranked alongside newcomers such as Roger Dubuis and Cartier, who were rightly proud of their Poinçon de Genève status because these brands didn't have a virtually integrated manufacturer. Remember our episode in this series concerning the Richemont Group. There were also eyebrows raised at what was perceived as Patek's refusal to have outside and impartial bodies judge its watches. Although this and Patek's innovations were garnering all the headlines, in the background Stern was quietly buying up businesses that moved Patek closer and closer to being entirely self-sufficient. Calam & Company, the high-end case maker, was acquired in 2001, followed by a polishing workshop called PolyArt and gem setter SHG, while in 2004 it absorbed a dial maker from Saint-Igné called Flückiger & Fils and Son, that was experiencing difficulties at the time. It was a process entirely in keeping with the expectation that at Patek Philippe all the company's president will have a vision for the company, and one that generally extends a decade into the future. That is certainly something Philippe's son and successor Thierry Stern, who took over in 2010, has. As well as having overseen the 175th anniversary celebration, which saw the brand launch a 20 complication ornately engraved watch called the Grandmaster Chime, an account of it including a complex grande sonnerie that chimed the quarters with 3 notes rather than 2, and a series of historically immersive exhibitions in places such as London, New York. Well, he is currently in the process of completing the next phase of expansion at Plan-les-Ouates, and this is a serious expansion. It's big. So this expansion is set to finish later on this year and will add another 50,000 square meter space that will house, among other things, an academy so that the watch industry can start to train future generation in elements of watchmaking craft that would otherwise be lost. It will also be the site where Patek will develop an in-house simple manual wind movement in an effort to entice a younger market who maybe can't quite stretch to anything in the current collection. Though given the platinum and diamond iteration of the Nautilus that was launched to celebrate the iconic design's 40th birthday, it's safe to say that Patek isn't about to start a price war with the likes of Omega anytime soon. So in nearly 200 years, Patek Philippe has gone from being a niche brand to a name synonymous with excellence in watchmaking, with a fulgurant development of the last 4 decades. And like I've already said a few times, they are in a league of their own and will hopefully, hopefully for them, will remain there. So this is it for this episode. Hope you liked it. Hope it wasn't too dense. Thanks for watching and see you real soon. All the best.